So, I was looking at a time lapse of geopolitical maps the other day,
Oh, I love those.
right? Just watching the borders shift around. And there is this moment right in the middle of the 20th century where the whole world just breaks apart.
He really
You
does.
go from 1900, where the map is just these massive, solid blocks of color. British pink, French blue.
Yeah, it's just swallowing entire continents.
Exactly. And then you hit 1970, and it's like someone dropped a glass vase on the floor. Suddenly there's shards everywhere, dozens of new borders, new flags, new governments.
It really is the single most dramatic renovation of the global house in human history. I mean, we aren't just talking about lines on a map changing here. We are talking about the complete dismantling of a system that had run the world for, well, 400 years.
And that is exactly what we're digging into today. For you listening, we've got a massive stack of research here on what's called the Architectures of Independence.
Specifically looking at AP European History Topic 9.9.
Right. But we aren't just here to memorize dates or anything. We're trying to figure out how this actually happened.
Uh-huh.
How do you go from a world where London and Paris basically own half the planet to a world of nearly 200 sovereign nations, all in the span of a single lifetime?
It's the question that really defines our modern reality. If you want to understand the UN or conflicts in the Middle East or the economic struggles in the global South today, you have to understand the mechanics of this collapse.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just one thing. It was this perfect storm of financial ruin, military exhaustion, and honestly, a very dangerous idea that sort of escaped the lab.
I actually want to start with that idea.
Mhm.
Because usually when we talk about decolonization, I think we tend to jump straight to the 1950s. The guys with the megaphones and the huge street protests.
Right, the classic footage.
Exactly. But the research suggests the fuse was actually lit way earlier, back in the wreckage of World War I.
It was. And the person holding the match might actually surprise a lot of people. It was an American president, Woodrow Wilson.
Which, honestly, feels a bit ironic.
Very.
Considering the U.S. wasn't exactly rushing to give up its own sphere of influence at the time. But he comes to the peace table in 1919 with this specific phrase: national self-determination.
Right. And on paper, it sounds incredibly noble. Wilson is looking at the ruins of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire, and he's arguing that people, specifically European groups like the Poles, the Czechs, the Hungarians, that they should have the right to choose their own government.
They shouldn't be subjects of a distant emperor.
Exactly. They should be citizens of their own state.
But there was a catch here. I was reading through the breakdown of the Versailles Conference in our sources, and it seems like there was a massive invisible asterisk next to that phrase.
A huge asterisk, and that asterisk read, Europeans only.
Yeah.
Wilson and the other Allied leaders were thinking purely about redrawing the map of Europe to prevent another war. They absolutely were not thinking about the millions of people in Vietnam or India or Kenya. In their minds, those populations just weren't, quote-unquote, ready for self-governance.
But you can't really contain an idea like that, can you?
No, you really can't.
I mean, you broadcast freedom for peoples on the global radio, and you can't be surprised when someone in Cairo or Calcutta tunes in and says, hey, I'll take some of that.
That is exactly what happened. It backfired spectacularly on the imperial powers. You had future revolutionary leaders, people who would later tear these empires apart, actually working in Paris or London at the time.
Just listening to all this rhetoric.
Hearing it and realizing the total hypocrisy. They saw that the Europeans had absolutely no intention of applying these high-minded rules to them.
And that adds a real layer of bitterness to it. It's not just, we want freedom. It's, you promised freedom and you lied.
And you have to remember the context of the time, too. World War I wasn't just fought by Europeans. The British and French dragged hundreds of thousands of colonial subjects into those trenches.
Right. Indians, Algerians, Senegalese soldiers.
They fought, they bled, they saw firsthand that the imperial powers weren't invincible, and then they went home expecting some kind of gratitude or reform.
And instead, they got the status quo. Just a pat on the back. Thanks for your service. Now get back in line.
Precisely. That resentment simmered for 20 years. It was the fuel. But it needed a spark to really explode, and that spark was World War II.
So if World War I cracked the foundation, World War II effectively bulldozed the house.
That's a very fair analogy, because by 1945, the situation is fundamentally different. It's not just about ideas anymore. It's about cold, hard cash.
Or the lack of it.
Exactly, the lack of it.
The sources emphasize this heavily. Britain and France weren't just tired after World War II, they were completely destitute.
They were bankrupt, their cities were rubble, their industries were bombed out, and their populations were living on strict rations. The British public was eating canned spam and stale bread.
Wow.
So the idea of spending millions of pounds to suppress a rebellion in India or Malaya just became political suicide.
So the whole calculus shifts. It's no longer about the sun never setting on the British Empire.
Yeah.
It's literally, can we afford to keep the lights on in Bombay?
And the answer was increasingly no. But there's also the psychological shift we touched on. In World War II, the colonial contribution was even more massive. You had millions of troops from the colonies fighting against the Axis powers.
Fighting against tyranny and occupation.
Right. Fighting against the explicit idea that one race has the right to dominate another.
You can clearly see the problem there.
Uh.
You can't teach a man to shoot fascists in the name of liberty and then expect him to go home and salute a colonial governor. The moral authority of the empire was completely shot.
So now the European powers are facing a nightmare scenario. They are broke, their military is exhausted, and their subjects are armed, trained, and demanding the very rights they all just fought for.
They had to make a choice.
Europe had to choose. Do we leave gracefully, or do we burn the house down on our way out?
And looking at the case studies in our deep dive here, they definitely didn't all choose the same door. It really seems like there were two main paths, the handshake or the gun.
Negotiated independence versus violent revolution, and which path a country took often depended heavily on how stubborn the colonizer was and how economically valuable the colony was.
Let's talk about the handshake model first. The biggest example there is obviously India.
It is. The British exit from India in 1947 is often cited as the model for a peaceful transfer of power, though we should note the partition itself was horrific and incredibly violent.
Right, the drawing of the borders.
Yes. But the actual achievement of independence from Britain was largely through sustained political pressure.
But we have to give credit where it's due here. This wasn't Britain just being benevolent and deciding to leave. The Indian National Congress and Gandhi didn't just ask nicely, they made the colony ungovernable.
That's the key. People often have this simplified view of Gandhi as just a spiritual leader. But his strategy of nonviolent civil disobedience was a highly precise economic weapon.
He was hitting them right in the wallet.
Exactly. When he calls for the boycott of British textiles, he's striking at the heart of the imperial economic engine. He's essentially saying, we aren't going to buy your stuff and we aren't going to work in your administration.
And if you have millions of people simply refusing to participate in the system.
You can't run the system.
So by 1947, Britain looks at the ledger. They see the cost of trying to police a subcontinent that absolutely refuses to be policed. And they compare it to their empty bank account back in London.
And they realize the math just doesn't work anymore. They cut their losses, they negotiate the transfer of power, and this sets a massive precedent globally. Once the jewel in the crown is gone, the rest of the empire starts to look like a major liability.
So that's the path where logic prevails. But then you have Algeria.
Yes, Algeria is where logic goes to die.
This one always shocks me. Because France let go of Morocco and Tunisia relatively easily. But with Algeria, they dug their heels in and fought a brutal 8-year war that killed hundreds of thousands of people. Why the massive difference?
It comes down to a legal fiction and a demographic reality.
Okay.
The legal fiction was that Algeria wasn't a colony. In the French Constitution, Algeria was actually part of France. It was divided into départements. To the French government, Algiers was as French as Paris or Lyon.
That is a massive distinction. Giving up India is losing a possession. Giving up Algeria is like cutting off your own arm.
Exactly. And then there's the demographic reality. The Pied Noir. There were nearly 1 million European settlers living in Algeria.
1 million.
1 million. And these weren't just soldiers on a temporary tour. These were families who had been there for generations. They owned vineyards, major businesses, homes. They were full French citizens who voted in French elections.
So when the National Liberation Front, the FLN, starts rising up in the 1950s, the French government isn't just dealing with some distant foreign policy issue. They have 1 million of their own voters screaming at them not to abandon them.
And that pressure cooker exploded. The war was incredibly dirty. Torture was systematic on both sides. There was terrorism in the cities. Napalm dropped in the countryside. It was so polarizing that it actually destroyed the government in Paris. That's the part that really blows my mind. A colonial war caused a regime change in the motherland.
It caused the total collapse of the Fourth Republic. The army in Algiers basically threatened a military coup against Paris because they thought the politicians were going to sell them out. It brought Charles de Gaulle back to power just to write a whole new constitution.
But even de Gaulle, who was this great nationalist, eventually had to fold.
He had to face reality. You simply cannot hold a population of millions against their will forever, not without becoming a totalitarian state yourself. So in 1962, despite all the protests and the horrific violence, Algeria became independent.
It's a tragic lesson in the limits of military power. But it brings up another really important point the research highlights. Getting the flag is just step one. Independence is a very slippery word.
It is. We tend to think of it as a light switch. Click, you're free.
Yeah.
But in reality, it was often more like a dimmer switch. And sometimes the wiring was faulty from the start.
Take Egypt. We've got this wild situation where they were technically independent since 1922. They had a king, they had a flag. But looking at the details in the sources, the British ambassador was basically still running the show.
It was puppet sovereignty. The British held on to the things that actually mattered: the Suez Canal, foreign policy, and the military. The Egyptian king was widely seen by his own people as a corrupt landlord who was basically just collecting rent for the British.
Which perfectly explains why the change, when it finally came, didn't come from the ballot box. It came from the barracks.
Right. The 1952 coup, you have Gamal Abdel Nasser and the Free Officers Movement. They looked at the politicians and the king and said, "You're all compromised." So the military stepped in, exiled the king, and finally kicked the British out of the Canal Zone.
This really seems to be the moment where the modern Middle East blueprint gets drawn. The charismatic military leader who promises to restore national dignity because the civilian government was too weak or corrupt.
Exactly. Nasser becomes the archetype for that. But notice the pattern here. True independence required a second revolution. The first one was on paper. The second one was the reality check.
And speaking of reality checks, we have to talk about Vietnam. Because if Algeria was a tragedy, Vietnam was a catastrophe that just kept shape-shifting.
Vietnam is the perfect example of how decolonization got completely hijacked by the Cold War.
Right, because it starts out pretty standard. Ho Chi Minh wants the French out. The French want to stay. They fight.
But the scale of the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954 cannot be overstated. We really need to pause on this. You have a modern, Western, conventional army paratroopers, heavy artillery, air support getting absolutely dismantled by a guerrilla force in the jungle.
It sent a massive shockwave through the entire Western world. It proved that the European empires weren't just morally bankrupt, they were militarily beatable.
It was the definitive end of the myth of invincibility. But for the Vietnamese, the victory at Dien Bien Phu was completely bittersweet. Because just as the French were leaving out the front door, the Americans were walking in the back door.
And this is where the whole narrative shifts. Suddenly, Ho Chi Minh isn't just a nationalist fighting a colonial power anymore. In the eyes of Washington, he's a red menace.
The lens changes entirely. The U.S. isn't looking at Vietnam as a colony seeking freedom. They are looking at it as a domino in the global struggle against communism. So they step in to prop up the South. The Vietnamese thought they had won their War of Independence in 1954, but they actually had to fight for another 20 years against a superpower with infinitely more firepower than France ever had.
Which brings us right into the Cold War trap. These new nations are being born into a world that is strictly divided. It's kind of like graduating from college and immediately being told you have to join one of two rival gangs or you don't get a job.
That's a great way to put it. The tragedy of the post-colonial world is that these nations attained sovereignty at the exact moment the world became violently bipolar. You are a new nation, say Ghana or Indonesia, and you need money. You need to build roads, schools, dams.
Because the empire extracted all your capital for a century.
Precisely. You have nothing, so where do you go?
You go to the bank. But there are only two banks in town. The First National Bank of Washington and the People's Credit Union of Moscow. And both of them demand extreme political loyalty as collateral.
Exactly. They say, we will build you a dam, but you have to vote with us at the UN. Or we will sell you fighter jets, but you have to ban the Communist Party. Or conversely, you have to ban the capitalist parties.
Look at Indonesia. That story is wild. You have Sukarno, the father of their independence, trying to play this delicate balancing act. But he leans a little too far toward the communists for the West's liking.
And the backlash is immediate and horrific. In 1965, you get a coup again, often with covert support from Western intelligence, and a brutal purge that kills 500,000 people. Sukarno is out, Suharto is in, and suddenly Indonesia is wide open for business with the West.
It's a stark reminder that sovereignty was highly conditional. You were free to run your country as long as you ran it in a way that didn't upset the superpower in your neighborhood.
And that's exactly why some nations tried to opt out. The non-aligned movement, leaders like Nehru in India, Nasser in Egypt, Tito in Yugoslavia, they tried to create a third path.
The Bandung Conference, right. The idea that we aren't East or West, we are the global South.
Yes. They wanted to focus strictly on internal development, not superpower ideology. But it was incredibly hard to maintain. When your people are starving and one side offers you 1 million tons of wheat, you take the wheat.
But the wheat always comes with strings.
Always. The non-aligned movement was a noble failure in many ways because the economic gravity of the US and the USSR was just too strong to escape.
So when we look back at this map of 1970, this shattered glass of new nations, it's not exactly a happy ending, is it? It's a start, but a very messy one.
It's a deeply complicated legacy. We went from a world of direct imperial control to a world of indirect influence. The flags on the buildings changed, but the economic supply chains often stayed exactly the same. The copper still went to Europe, the rubber still went to America.
Which really makes you rethink the whole concept of that era. We call it decolonization, which implies a finished process. The colonizers left. But hearing all this,
It wasn't a clean break, it was a transformation. And that leaves us with a very difficult question to chew on.
what's that?
Well, we look at the global south today, the instability, the debt crises, the struggles with governance, and we often blame it on local corruption or poor leadership, and those things certainly exist. But if we look at the history we just discussed, we really have to ask, did these nations ever actually get a chance to start from zero?
Right. I mean, for you listening, think about it. If you are born into massive debt, and your government is being engineered by a Cold War superpower on day one, are you actually independent?
Exactly. Are we looking at the natural failures of new nations? Or are we really just looking at the ghost of the Cold War map still haunting the global economy 50 years later? Because it kind of seems like the empires didn't disappear, they just learned to manage their interests remotely.
That is a heavy thought to leave on.
Yeah,
It definitely changes how I'm going to read the international news section tomorrow.
it should. The past isn't dead. It's not even past.
Well, on that note, we are going to wrap up this deep dive. A huge thank you for helping us unpack this massive, complex slice of history.
Always a pleasure to be here.
And to everyone listening, thanks for diving in with us. Keep questioning the map. We'll see you next time.